Good afternoon. I'm Melissa Meeks. I'm the Director of Professional Development for Eli Review, and I help instructors with all the things: course design, troubleshooting, research, you name it. And Eli Review, for some of you who are unfamiliar with the tool, is invented by instructors for instructors. So it was developed by Bill Hart Davidson and Jeff Grable at Michigan State University. And the whole point is to promote effective peer feedback and critical thinking. The basics of the app include students turning in a little piece of writing or a big piece of writing, just something to start with, a draft to share. Then they give each other feedback using questions you design. They also get feedback, including some class trends that you can talk about with your students and ways that you can interact with the feedback that they've received. Then they act on that feedback to plan a revision. And the idea is that they would repeat this as much as possible. Our team really talks about what we call giver's gain. And that's the benefits of giving helpful feedback. But giving helpful feedback is really hard. And so that's how your review task sets the stage for the ways students notice and discuss the criteria that improve their work. So to kind of put a highlight on the work of guiding students and talking about their work in progress, we're hosting this showcase across disciplines, and we're so happy today to have Mike Wilton from University of California, Santa Barbara, and Daniela from University of Rhode Island. And so Mike is going to start us by sharing one of the reviews in his class, and we'll talk through that, and then Daniela will present, and then we'll open the floor for questions. You are welcome to use the chat to kind of remember your questions as we go, or to engage in all the back channel that makes these kinds of interactions fun. So Mike, I've passed the ball so that you can share your screen when you're ready.
Great. So do you want to start with the review task so they can see what items I have here?
Before that, could you just tell us about your course and about the writing assignment that comes before this review, just a little bit?
Sure, of course. So I teach a large enrollment, predominantly lecture-based introductory biology course. It's a second-year course here at UC Santa Barbara, and it enrolls about 300 students. It's typically capped at about 280. And so what I did when I built this course is I found certain topics were really hard for students to answer. So the way I did this is by looking at previous exam response rates and questions that they often got incorrect. And so through that analysis, I found two areas that were kind of spread between parts of my course that I could implement a right to learn assignment, because as Melissa said, I knew that stronger students would get the giver's gain, as well as they'd also be able to help other students kind of correct any sort of misconceptions that they have. And so what I'm showing you here, actually, I can actually show you the prompt. I have it open. What I did is I asked the students to write about the central dogma. So if you are a molecular biologist, you know that the central dogma is where you go from DNA, the blueprints, you turn it into RNA, which is the messenger that's going to take your blueprints and move to the cytoplasm of the eukaryote, and then you translate that into protein. And I noticed that a lot of students got confused by the complexity of that kind of process. They also confused it with DNA replication, which is a similar but unrelated process. So this seemed like a really good topic for me to focus in on. And as Melissa said, my writing assignment is very short. It's 300 to 400 words. But I want them to summarize the entire process in their own words, in 300 to 400 words, at a level that their peers could also understand. Does that answer that first part of the question, Melissa?
It does. And now can you talk us through the review design?
Yes. So in terms of the review design, what we decided to do is we have various traits that we wanted the students to include. And so we went kind of backwards, and we were like, okay, an ideal answer would look like what? And we came up with that answer ourselves. And then we started parsing apart what are the specific items that we think would be in this ideal answer, and putting them in as these checkboxes shown here on the right-hand side. And this is actually the student preview. This is what, if I was editing one of my peers' submissions, the submission would be here on the left, right in this gray box. And here are all the various traits that I would ask them to be identifying throughout their peers' review itself. At the very bottom, we have this trait identification looking at not just specifics in terms of content, like the various steps of the central dogma, but also the language and the kind of the flow of the prompt. We're not grading the students on this, right? It's basically to help them improve their understanding. So we just say, be honest, click what's present, click what things are present in terms of their flow and organization, and then also give this scaled response down here with specific feedback. As you'll see, there are going to be actual contextual comments too, where the students, the reviewers can put in specific reviews like, hey, you missed a specific part that Mike talked about in the lecture video. Go back and add in the various sites of the ribosome that are going to be involved in translation, for example. So it's a mixture of both like trait identification in terms of elements that are present or absent, as well as contextual feedback and an overall rating of the review, providing kind of textual feedback as well. Does that help as well, Melissa?
It does. I also just want to ask you to say one more thing about the difference between this contextual comment prompt and the final comment. So what I notice is that the contextual comment says, you know, highlight something in the draft and write 1 to 2 sentences. And then the final comment has sort of like sentence starters. Tell me about how you got to offer those two kinds of open-ended feedback.
Yeah, so the idea here was to kind of allow for students first in the contextual comments to write things that came to their minds based on reading the prompt. So for example, if they were thinking that they're missing a specific content element, could they kind of identify that themselves and expand on telling the student where they could find that information? And if I have a few minutes at the end, I can show you an example of that with the student feedback. And then with the final comments, what we did is we created these sentence starters kind of as a guide to help kind of jog the reviewer's memory and be like, hey, you know what would be really helpful is for you to kind of talk about these specific things to allow for your peer who will receive this feedback to kind of take that information in themselves and then reform their kind of approach or their answers and in their resubmission plan when they re-upload their draft incorporating these revisions.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike, for this tour.
Yeah.
And we'll come back to questions for you in a second. Daniela, would you please share with us your course and then the writing task and the review?
Sure. Let me start sharing my screen with you so you can see my actual. So I will then start with the writing task. So I work also with interbio course. It's actually the first series of 2 interbio courses here at the University of Rhode Island. So most of my students are freshmen. They are just arriving at the university. It's also a very high enrollment course. I have around 250 to 280 students. And the way that I set up the course, it is every week that we work in a different topic inside the material, we kind of like work towards answering a big question that is related to that topic, but it's very applied to things. So for example, for this writing task that I'm showing you here, the question of the week was what makes the death cap mushroom so deadly? And that is when we are talking about transcription. And so students would really at the end of the week, after passing through all the process of how transcription occurs, they would be able to answer this question. And so basically we have very short writing assignments at least once a week or once at 2 weeks, depending on how long the topic takes us to cover. For this particular one, I just gave a brief introduction on kind of like guiding them to the answer, because if you just read the question, like what makes this death cap mushroom so deadly, it's not really clear to you where I want them to go and how this connects to the topic of transcription. So I kind of like gave them an introduction about the toxins and that could cause the death of a person, and then I asked the question and they have to answer what makes this species toxin so harmful that even 1 cap can kill an adult. And I asked them to keep it short, so around 90 words, and they also have to do some research on that topic to kind of like answer that. So we are also working on them getting the answer for such an applied question. And then for the review one, what I do is like I try to guide them with this trait identification for exactly how Mike was describing. I first come up with one answer, and then I think, what is a complete answer should have? What are the topics that it should be covering? And so I put it here, and so they kind of like identify if that answer from their peers meets this criteria based on, or it's present those traits in their answer. And then I also have this scale response where they can evaluate how concise, easy to understand, and how well the question address the actual prompt, the actual question. And I also asked them to give contextual comments, but I specifically worked with them in using the formula that we worked in ELI review of describe, evaluate, and suggest. And I found that that was a great way for my students to kind of like understand the type of comments that they were supposed to give to their peers. So first they describe what they understood by reading their peers' answer, and then they evaluate how well that answer fits with the prompt that I asked, so with the question that I asked them. And I believe by having this scaled response helps them to understand how well that answer is fitting with the actual question. And then at the end, they suggest a way to improve that answer. So what else they could add, what it's missing in that answer that would improve the quality. And I always stress a lot the fact with them that even if the answer already has all the topics, all the traits, it is concise, there's always room for improvement. So the suggestion on a way to improve, it's always important to be there. And so with this, they can provide each other feedback, and then they go back, review their initial draft based on what they got as a feedback, and resubmit the final answer for that particular question.
That's great. Thank you both for sharing your reviews. And so now I'm going to ask you to reflect on how you know these reviews work, whatever work means to you. So when you think back, there's no way that you're reading 250, 300 student responses all the time. So what information, data, feelings, vibes, whatever, lets you know this activity is worth the time and energy you put into it?
Who should go first?
You can go first.
Okay, so the first thing I would say that makes feel that this is really working, it is to see another information about my course. I use at least one open-ended question in my exams. I know it's a lot to grade, but it's a good kind of like a use for the students to see even like the improvement on this writing part. And I can see how the level of the answers has been changing as we move through the semester. But more than that, and I think I can share this with you as well, in the middle of the semester, I did a survey about all the activities that we were doing in the course to kind of like have a sense on how these students were perceiving these activities. And this question was exactly right across for ELI review. And then I asked them what are their opinion about ELI review and gave these options. And as you can see, I had from a class of like 260, 76% said that I like the questions, one more opportunity to practice. And then I also gave them a space for giving me feedback on that and how, what are the things that they think we could improve. And here are some of the things that I got from them, saying like, I like ELI review more than other activities. I think the feedback is very useful. It helps to practice the material further. It's a great way to cover some of the more important topics we need to review. I enjoy ELI review. It strengthened my understanding of the topic that they focus on. So obviously it wasn't all the comments positive, but some of the comments, the ones that were not so positive, most of the things that they complain about is just like, I would like to work in a shorter time for these, because sometimes because we have such a large class, such a large enrollment, it is hard to keep pace of like everyone giving feedback timely in a framework of like few hours. And some students are really anxious and they just want to kind of like work on that question and resubmit their answer. I didn't have anyone complaining about not thinking that wasn't useful. So I think that's really a proof that it's working very well.
I would echo the same thing. Since I tell my students that the purpose of these assignments is to help them improve their understanding of central course concepts, they can see the direct benefit to putting the effort into the material that I'm trying to help them learn. And so with 280 students in the first year that we did this, what we did is we did a regression analysis, and I can also share that with you. So in fall 2018, we did a regression analysis, and since we have a sophomore course, it's a second year course, we have the students' cumulative science GPA, and that's a very, very good predictor of student academic achievement before coming to my class. It's the highest predictor that we have, higher than SAT. And then we controlled for various demographics, right? So if they're first generation student, or if they're underrepresented minority or peers, people excluded based on ethnicity or race, we can control for those different demographics as well as their cumulative science GPA. Remember, that's a really good predictor of their kind of academic achievement in my course. And when you control for all that, doing a multivariate regression, you get 5 points more or 5 points higher on the final exam. And we have many questions on the central dogma, as well as meiosis, which is our second prompt that we incorporate into this course on that final exam. And so when we look at the average of the students who participated in this versus those who did not in fall of 2018, because we had two groups, we saw that those who participated earned significantly higher correct proportions on the questions on central dogma versus meiosis. And the second thing I'd like to show you is just an unsolicited email that I got from a student. I've cropped their name out as well as the rest of the email, but the student goes on to say, I really appreciated it. I found this very helpful, actually, that weird qualifier there, especially because I felt I really understood it before I wrote the first draft. But when I came back to revise the draft, I realized I completely missed some major parts of the central dogma, and I was shocked that I did. It was pretty eye-opening. I'm really glad that I did it. So this year, actually, we made it part of our course. We made both of them worth 2% of our final grades. And we have about 80 out of 285 students who completed all three parts. So the submission, the initial submission of themselves, their peer reviews of at least 2 other students, and then their revised draft that they uploaded at the end. So I think as long as you tell the students why they're doing these things and they can see the actual benefit when they write their midterm, for example, or if they're going to write an essay for your class, it really goes a long way. And I've received almost no pushback. So I'm really happy with it personally.
Mike, thanks for tackling Ingrid's question in the chat.
And
Ingrid, yeah, and Ingrid, you can speak up and ask your question aloud too, because they're great. I think a lot of instructors struggle with this. What do you do to manage students' expectations that you are not the grader of all these things?
So in my context, this is an all or nothing experience, right? So you don't get any points ascribed based on the star rating of the students. You get all 2% if you complete all 3 parts and you put in that effort. If I can share my screen really quickly, I'll show you some of the student reviews. And they're actually, I shouldn't say that, they're really great, right? So this is, for example, classmate 99. And you can see that he got these reviews and the various traits that the students selected for the student's review. He did well on the first part in terms of trait identification, but he did less well in terms of very specific parts of the central dogma. In fact, he missed coding versus template DNA strands, whereas the class average was 60%. And if you scroll down to see those written responses from the students of the overall, right, there are a few elements that you left out and it was a little lengthy, but it's already very good. Strong draft with good organization. Once certain details are added in, then this rough draft will be fully formed. The writing is clear. So as long as you build on what we talked about, you're good to go. And then they basically, here are the contextual responses that they're given that they're missing, right? So you forgot to mention the poly A tail and the 5' cat. You might want to add template versus coding, which was identified above, like we just talked about. And then here are the final comments. So you can see that they're actually giving really good feedback when they're directed by having really strong trait identification features during that review step. And so I'm not seeing, there we go. So it's just one of those things that if you build the structures like Melissa talked about, and Danielle also showed you, it becomes really easy for students to provide the insight because you're working on the hive mind, giving all the answers, right? And so long as they're willing to participate and play, I think you'll be really surprised by what the students can actually produce for one another.
So just to add to what Mike said, one thing that I also did is like I have undergraduate learning assistants who help me with the class. They are not supposed to see like grades and anything, but because it has the ability to do it all anonymous, the reviews, what I do is like my learning assistants, they help me reading through the comments, and then they endorse the best comments or the best feedbacks that was giving. And so the students have, when they see that one feedback was endorsed, they know that someone from the teaching team read that and knew that that was a good update to their answer. And so it gives them that sense that even though we are not giving directly feedback, we are still guiding them through which are the best feedbacks that they should be using for their review.
So I think Ingrid has another question, which is how do you manage those who don't complete the assignments? And what if one person is in groups with 2 to 3 who don't do the reviews? So I think this is something that Daniela kind of alluded to earlier, where she's saying you can't have your windows between like review and then resubmission too tight. So in my context at UC Santa Barbara, we're on the quarter system, and I'm going to answer the other question in that tier too. So the quarter system is like warp speed. It's 10 weeks. And we do 2 ELI reviews. And we do the ELI reviews typically over a week and a half to 2 weeks in terms of their time frame. So we give the students about 3 or 4 days to write their initial draft. And then we have like a buffer window between that and then the review period. So we have another 3 or 4 days for the review period. And then we have that buffer window for anyone who's late. I send an email being like, hey, you're late, get this done, right? And I send it to the class. I don't look through and see who's done what, but I'm like, your deadline is coming, your deadline is passed, get it done. And then I do the last resubmit for 3 or 4 days. So I do 2, one on central dogma and one on meiosis, and that takes up a significant chunk of my quarter because it's only 10 weeks long.
So the way I do it is because since we work much more frequent on these assignments and they are shorter assignments, I do have grades separated for each of the tasks, and basically it's like they are worth like, let's say 10 points, and so 2.5 for each of the tasks that they complete. And they know that if they miss the deadline for the writing, they will mostly not be able to get the reminder of the assignment completed because they will not be able to be assigned to groups and so on and so forth. One thing that they actually asked me to do is to set us, for example, an assignment on Brightspace who can remind them the deadlines. And so I've been doing this, and that's helping them to keep up with the dates. Another thing that I do is, sorry, I forgot what I was supposed to say. But yeah, so I keep it like separated, the feedbacks from the writing. So they know that if they mess up with one part, they will miss all the reminder of the assignment. And so far it seems to be working, at least like, and I also try to do some of those tasks, like for example, the feedbacks during the class. So they really kind of like, I'm giving that time for them to work on that because they are short. And so it takes like 5-10 minutes from the class. And this also, it's been working well in making sure that everyone completes. Another thing that I also do, it's like I always include in the review part, saying that if they did not receive feedbacks before the deadline for the resubmission from their peers, they can still revise and resubmit their question based on the feedback that they gave to their peers. So they had the opportunity to read other 2 or 3 answers which probably address the things that they were not aware of. And also after seeing the prompt with the trait identification can give them a more directly path on what their answer should contain. And so they can review their answer based on this experience that they had. And so considering all these things together, it's been working well with this many students.
I love that because you're really relying on giver's gain there. right? Like the whole benefit is what you teach yourself in this process. So once you've seen a comparison between what you've done and what the criteria expect, you can adjust your own work. You don't need people to tell you that. It's the feedback from others is just a bonus. It's icing, right? The cake is giving the feedback. So thank you for that, Daniela. Are there so Susan Marie, Daniela's doing about once a week and Mike's doing 2 reviews. That's the difference there. And then Maria, both of these instructors are at schools that have an institutional purchase of Eli Review. So their students do not pay directly, but the institution does. Ingrid asks, what about debriefing? Do you ever talk about Eli from the front of the room, or do you record a video of the best model answers? Do you publish the best answers on your course management system?
In the past, I've done that where I've taken the answers from some excellent students and I show them at the front of the class. Typically before lecture, I mean, in COVID age, not so much, but before lecture, I'd have it cycling through with like clicker questions and things of that nature, just so they can see it. Other than that, I tell the students after they're done that they will be seeing this material on summative assessments, right? So they get that direct output there. But I typically also show them some of the data that I showed you all too, kind of to get more buy-in from the students, right? Where I say, look, we have the science to show you that people who participate wholly in this endeavor do better, right? So this is like an effective way to learn this material. But other in terms of debrief afterwards, not so much, because we won't collect the summative data until the final exam.
Can I
didn't do any debriefing at all, but I did work with them at least in one example on how to give feedback. And for that, I did like selected one answer that was actually not a perfect answer for the prompt. And then I showed them how I would give a feedback using the describe, evaluate, and suggest formula. And that was one of the things that helped them to understand the system and the model and how they would do that for all the other questions.
So I think that was more what Danielle just said, was more what I was getting at in terms of the debriefing. When I use Eli, even after students have done it a couple times, I still feel like their feedback isn't, you know, the few students that are great students, they're always giving great feedback. So like, I guess, like, do you use any kind of, whether it's using actual Eli activity or data, but like, in order to get more of the student population really giving constructive feedback, like, I guess, how do you get them to do that? Or does it just happen organically?
So after I did the demonstration for them on like what types of words I would be using and how to use this specifically, describe, evaluate, and then suggest, they understood what that means, and then the quality of feedbacks had improved. Obviously, it took them like 1 or 2 weeks to practice that model and then to get better, but it was something that was based on practice and then seeing one initial example of that.
I think in my context, by having those really, I don't want to say extensive, but long lists of traits that you should be looking for, right, that immediately draws the reviewers to areas that they can then refer to in the actual comment, where I say, please provide 1 or 2 sentences with constructive feedback, because then they'll refer back to the list of traits and they'll be like, you know, you're missing this thing, this trait up here. Here's where you can find it. This is the actual stuff that you should be adding in. Right, so it kind of draws their attention such that you can solicit exactly what you want. So having a really careful construction of those traits that you want identified, and then also following it with the actual textual feedback, being like, okay, you identified these things, please refer your students in 1 or 2 sentences to what they should be putting in. It's a way that you can kind of ensure that you'll get as much productive feedback as possible, at least in our context.
It is 3:30, so I want to respect your time. I'm going to stop